Welcome to Spicy Family Scandals, where real-life drama meets hard-earned wisdom. Today's story is about betrayal, resilience, and the power of standing up for yourself. Let's dive in.
The moment I heard the words, my hand froze mid-stroke, the sponge still dripping soap suds into the sink. "You're a placeholder, Ellie," Sharon's voice rang out, loud enough to echo into the kitchen. David would never admit it, but we both know it's true. I didn't turn around. I didn't move. It wasn't the insult itself that made my stomach drop. It was the silence that followed. No sharp retort from David. No laugh to break the tension. Nothing. Just the quiet sound of Sharon sipping her wine like she hadn't just dropped a bomb in the middle of my home. "You've had 10 years to prove yourself, sweetheart," she continued, her words cutting with the precision of someone who had practiced this speech in the mirror. "And well, we've all seen the results." Still, I didn't respond. I could feel my heart pounding, blood rushing in my ears. But the sting of her words wasn't what had me gripping the edge of the counter. It was the fact that she wasn't wrong, at least not entirely. I had spent 10 years trying to mold myself into the kind of wife Sharon would approve of, into the kind of woman David would defend. And in all that time, I'd gained nothing but a string of hollow victories. A polite nod here, a grudging compliment there, and the occasional, "Well, that's an improvement," whenever I bent myself into an unrecognizable version of who I used to be. But this was different. There was something in her voice tonight. An edge I hadn't heard before. It wasn't just disdain, it was finality. Like she'd decided something about me. And David had silently agreed. "Well, at least she cleans," Sharon quipped. And that's when I heard it. David's laugh. It was short, clipped, almost uncomfortable, but it was there. A laugh. My husband, my partner, the man who had vowed to love and protect me, was laughing at me with his mother. That was when I knew. Something had shifted. Whatever illusion of partnership I thought we had was gone. I turned off the faucet and wiped my hands, the simple motion grounding me as the realization hit. This wasn't just Sharon's game anymore. David was in on it too. I walked into the living room, forcing a calm smile as I leaned against the doorway. "You know," I said lightly, "I've been thinking too." Sharon raised an eyebrow, amused, while David looked up from his phone, clearly unprepared for my presence. "Oh," Sharon drawled. "Do tell." I glanced at David, then back at her. "I think you're right. About me not being good enough." Sharon's smile widened in triumph. "Well, dear, it's not about being." I cut her off. "But the funny thing is, Sharon, I've realized something else. You're not good enough for me either." The room went silent. Sharon blinked, the words clearly not computing. David stared at me, his mouth slightly open like he couldn't believe what he'd just heard. I pushed off the doorframe, crossing the room to stand directly in front of Sharon. My heart was racing, but I kept my voice steady. "You've spent 10 years trying to convince me I'm lucky to be in this family. But the truth is, you're the lucky ones. I've bent over backward to make this work, and you, both of you, have done nothing but take." David started to protest, but I held up a hand. "Don't. I'm not finished." I turned to him, my voice colder now. "You laughed at me. Do you know how humiliating that is? To hear your own husband laugh while his mother calls you worthless." "Ellie, come on," he said, shifting uncomfortably. "It's not like that." "Then what is it like, David?" I snapped. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks an awful lot like betrayal." He didn't answer. Of course he didn't. He never had the spine to stand up to Sharon, and now he couldn't even stand up for himself. I looked back at Sharon, who was watching me with a mixture of shock and irritation, clearly unused to being challenged. "You're not going to like what happens next," I said quietly, "but that's not my problem anymore." Without another word, I walked out of the room and up the stairs, leaving them both sitting there in stunned silence. I had spent the past 10 years trying to hold this family together. But tonight I wasn't interested in holding anything together. Tonight I was going to burn it all down. The next morning, I was already awake when David stirred beside me. I hadn't slept a wink, but I wasn't tired. I'd spent the night making plans, going over every detail in my mind until they were sharp and clear as glass. David stretched and groaned, oblivious to the storm brewing next to him. "Morning," he mumbled, reaching for his phone on the nightstand. I didn't respond. Instead, I watched as he scrolled through his notifications, his brow furrowing slightly at whatever meaningless headline had caught his attention. "Hey," he said without looking at me. "Do you think you could make pancakes today? Mom loves your pancakes." I didn't reply, but I got up and headed downstairs, leaving him to his phone and his ignorance. In the kitchen, Sharon was already seated at the table, sipping her coffee like she owned the place. She glanced up as I walked in, her lips curling into that familiar condescending smile. "Well, good morning," she said, her tone sickly sweet. "I hope you're not still upset about last night. You know I only say these things because I care." I didn't answer her either. Instead, I pulled out the ingredients for pancakes and started cooking. The sizzle of batter hitting the pan was the only sound in the room for a few minutes, and I could feel Sharon watching me, waiting for some kind of reaction. When the pancakes were done, I set a plate in front of her, then one at David's usual spot. "Eat up," I said with a tight smile. Sharon raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. She cut into the pancake and took a bite, humming in satisfaction. "You know," she said between bites, "if you spent this much effort on everything else, maybe you'd actually measure up." I didn't flinch. I didn't even blink. Instead, I sat down across from her and poured myself a cup of coffee, watching as she ate. A few minutes later, David came downstairs, his hair a mess and his shirt wrinkled. He sat down and started eating without a word, scrolling through his phone with one hand while he shoveled food into his mouth with the other. I waited until they were both halfway through their plates before I spoke. "You're probably wondering why I made breakfast this morning," I said casually, swirling my coffee. David glanced up, confused. Sharon set down her fork, her expression wary now. "I just wanted to make sure you both had full stomachs before I ruined your day," I continued, my tone light. David frowned. "What are you talking about?" I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms as I met Sharon's gaze. "Last night was the last time you're going to humiliate me in my own home," I said. "I've had enough. And since you've made it so clear that I'll never be good enough for your son, I've decided to do something about it." Sharon's face hardened, but David was still staring at me, baffled. "Ellie, what are you talking about?" he repeated. I stood up, pulling a folded piece of paper from my pocket and tossing it onto the table in front of him. "That," I said, "is a copy of the divorce petition I filed this morning." David froze, his fork hovering midair. Sharon's eyes widened, and for the first time, I saw real shock on her face. "You're joking," David said, his voice low. I shook my head. "Not joking. I'm done, David. I'm done with you, with her, with this entire charade." "You can't be serious," Sharon snapped, her voice rising. "After everything we've done for you." I cut her off with a laugh. "Everything you've done for me? Sharon, the only thing you've done for me is make me question my own worth every single day. And you?" I turned to David, my voice shaking now with barely contained fury. "You just stood there and let her. You let her tear me apart over and over. And then you had the audacity to laugh with her last night." David opened his mouth to argue, but I didn't give him the chance. "Don't bother," I said. "I've heard it all before. Excuses, apologies, promises to do better. I'm done listening. You've made it clear where your loyalty lies, and now I'm making it clear where mine does." Sharon stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You can't just walk away," she hissed. "David's put up with you for 10 years. I laughed again, louder this time. "Put up with me? Sharon, I've been the only one holding this family together, while you've done everything in your power to tear it apart. And now," I gestured around the room, "now it's all yours. Congratulations." With that, I turned and walked out, leaving them both staring after me in stunned silence. But this wasn't the end, not by a long shot. They thought they knew me, thought they could predict my every move. They were wrong. I wasn't just walking away, I was taking something with me. Something they wouldn't realize was missing until it was too late. David's voice followed me as I grabbed my coat from the hallway. "Ellie! Ellie, come back here!" he shouted, the panic creeping into his tone. I didn't stop. Not for him, not for Sharon, who I could hear muttering something sharp and indignant behind me. I stepped out the door, the brisk morning air hitting my face like a wake-up call. And for a moment, I felt an unfamiliar calm settle over me. The world outside was quiet, unaware of the chaos I had just unleashed inside. But the calm didn't last. I climbed into my car, hands gripping the steering wheel, and exhaled a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. This wasn't over. Not yet. By the time I returned later that afternoon, the atmosphere inside the house was thick with tension. Sharon was sitting stiffly on the couch, her lips pressed into a thin line, and David stood in the middle of the room, his hands on his hips like he was about to deliver a lecture. "Where were you?" he demanded the moment I walked in. I raised an eyebrow at him, shrugging off my coat and hanging it neatly by the door. "Out," I said simply. "That's it? Out." He sounded incredulous. "You just drop a bombshell like that, disappear for hours and come back like nothing happened?" I crossed the room slowly, feeling their eyes on me, and picked up my phone from the kitchen counter where I'd left it that morning. "Did you eat lunch?" I asked casually, scrolling through my notifications. David's jaw tightened, but Sharon was the one who spoke next. You think this is a game, don't you? She snapped. Dragging my son through this nonsense, humiliating him like that. Humiliating him? I interrupted, looking up sharply. Oh, Sharon, you haven't seen humiliation yet. But don't worry, it's coming. She froze, the color draining from her face, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of doubt in her eyes. David stepped forward, his hands raised in a placating gesture. Ellie, let's talk about this, he said, his tone softening. We don't need to make any rash decisions. Rash? I cut him off, my voice rising. Rash was what you did last night when you laughed at me. Rash was letting your mother treat me like dirt for a decade without saying a word. This. I gestured between us. This is calculated. Thought out. Long overdue. His mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, but he had no response. Good. I have a few things to say, I continued, my voice steady now. And I suggest you both listen carefully, because I'm only going to say them once. I turned to Sharon first, fixing her with a cold, hard stare. For years I've let you undermine me, belittle me, make me question my own worth. Why? Because I thought if I could just prove myself, if I could just get you to accept me, then maybe, just maybe, you'd back off. But you never did. And you never will, because the truth is, Sharon, your problem with me isn't about me at all. It's about you. Her eyes narrowed, but she didn't interrupt. You've spent so much time controlling David that you can't stand the idea of him having someone else in his life. You don't want a daughter-in-law, you want a puppet. Someone who'll bow to you, worship you, and make you feel like the queen of this little castle you've built. Well, newsflash. I'm not that person. And I never will be. I turned to David now, who was staring at me like he didn't recognize the woman in front of him. And you, I said, my voice cracking slightly. You were supposed to be my partner. My protector. My husband. But instead you stood there and let her tear me down over and over again. And last night. My voice broke completely now, and I took a deep breath to steady myself. Last night you didn't just let her. You joined her. Ellie, Don't, I said sharply, holding up a hand. Don't apologize. Don't make excuses. Just stop. I stepped back, the silence in the room deafening. Sharon's mouth was a tight, angry line, but she still didn't speak. David looked like he was about to crumble under the weight of my words, but I didn't care. For once I was the one in control. You think this is the end of the story? I said quietly, my gaze flicking between them. It's not. This is just the beginning. You'll both learn soon enough what it feels like to lose the upper hand. To lose control. To lose me. With that, I walked upstairs, leaving them to stew in the fallout. But even as I closed the door to the bedroom behind me, I knew this wasn't the final act. Not yet. The real revenge was still to come. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the muffled voices of David and Sharon downstairs. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I didn't need to. Their anger, their confusion, their attempts to regain control. It was all predictable. But I wasn't playing by their rules anymore. I slipped out of bed and padded over to the closet, careful not to make a sound. From the back of the top shelf, I pulled down a small lockbox. Inside was a collection of documents I had been quietly gathering for months. Bank statements, contracts, emails. It had all started as a faint nagging suspicion, just a thread I couldn't help but pull. And oh, how that thread had unraveled. David's financial habits were, let's just say, less than transparent. The mysterious withdrawals, the unaccounted for expenses, the odd shifts in his demeanor whenever I asked a question too directly. It had all added up to something I couldn't ignore. I had dug deeper, combing through every scrap of evidence I could find, until the truth came into focus. David wasn't just spineless. He was reckless. Careless. And Sharon? Well, let's just say she wasn't entirely innocent in the matter either. I slipped the documents back into the box and locked it, my mind racing with the possibilities. The next morning I made breakfast again. This time, I was greeted with wary silence when I entered the kitchen. Sharon sat stiffly at the table, her eyes darting toward me like I might explode at any moment. David hovered near the counter, sipping his coffee and pretending to read an article on his phone. I placed a cup of tea in front of Sharon and took a seat across from her, the tension between us almost palpable. Didn't expect you to cook for us again, she said finally, her voice brittle. I smiled. Oh, I thought I'd make the most of the time we have left together. After all, things are going to change around here very soon. Her eyes narrowed, but she didn't respond. David cleared his throat, glancing nervously between us. Ellie, about yesterday, he began. I think we all got a little carried away. I held up a hand, cutting him off. Don't, I said calmly. We don't need to rehash it. In fact, I think it's time we move forward. Sharon snorted. And what exactly does moving forward look like to you? I leaned back in my chair, studying her for a moment before I spoke. It means I've made some decisions. Big ones. And they're going to affect all of us. David looked alarmed. Ellie, what are you talking about? I folded my hands on the table, my smile widening. David, how much do you think Sharon knows about your finances? His face drained of color and Sharon frowned. What does that have to do with anything? Oh, I'd say it has everything to do with it, I replied smoothly. See, David and I share a lot of things. A house, a bank account, certain legal responsibilities. But it seems you've been less than honest with me about some of those responsibilities, haven't you, David? Ellie, he said, his voice low and warning. This isn't the time. Oh, but it is, I interrupted. I turned to Sharon, whose confusion was rapidly turning to irritation. Did you know your precious son has been gambling? I asked her. What? She snapped, her eyes narrowing. David, tell her, I said, my tone sweet. Tell her about the late-night poker games, the online betting accounts, the loan you took out without telling me. Ellie, stop, he shouted, slamming his coffee mug on the counter. I didn't flinch. Instead, I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small envelope, sliding it across the table to Sharon. Here. Have a look. She hesitated, her eyes flicking between me and the envelope, before snatching it up and tearing it open. Inside were copies of the loan agreements David had signed, along with screenshots of his betting accounts. Her face turned an alarming shade of red as she flipped through the papers, her hands trembling. David, what the hell is this? Mom, I can explain, he stammered, his voice cracking. It's not as bad as it looks. It's exactly as bad as it looks, I said, standing up. And here's the best part. The house is in my name. The accounts? Jointly held. The debts? All yours, David. I've already spoken to a lawyer, and I've started the process of separating everything. By the time I'm done, you'll be lucky if you have a couch to sleep on. Sharon looked like she was about to implode. You can't do this, she shrieked, slamming the papers on the table. This is my family. Not anymore, I said, my voice icy. You've spent 10 years treating me like an outsider, and now I'm giving you exactly what you wanted. I'm out, but I'm taking everything with me. David slumped into a chair, his head in his hands, while Sharon stared at me with pure, unfiltered rage. I picked up my keys and turned to leave, pausing in the doorway. Oh, and Sharon? I said over my shoulder. You might want to get comfortable. David's going to need a place to stay. And with that, I walked out the door, the sound of their shouting echoing behind me. I didn't go far after leaving the house. I parked my car a block away, sitting there with the engine off and the windows cracked, just enough to let the cool air seep in. My hands were steady on the steering wheel, my heart pounding with a strange mix of adrenaline and satisfaction. I imagined the scene I'd left behind, the chaos, the accusations, the blame. David scrambling to explain himself, Sharon losing what little composure she had left. For a moment I let myself savor it. But this wasn't over yet. I opened the glove compartment and pulled out my phone, scrolling to a contact I hadn't called in years. My thumb hovered over the name for a moment before I pressed it. Ellie. The voice on the other end sounded surprised, even cautious. Hi, Linda, I said, keeping my voice calm. I think it's time we had that talk. There was a pause, then a deep sigh. I was wondering when you'd call. Linda was Sharon's oldest friend, or at least she had been. They'd fallen out years ago over something petty, some argument that had spiraled into a full-blown feud. Sharon had never told me the details, but I'd pieced together enough over the years to know that Linda had secrets. Secrets about Sharon, about David, about their oh-so-perfect family. And Linda, it seemed, was more than happy to share. We met at a quiet cafe on the edge of town, the kind of place where no one asks questions and no one pays attention. Linda looked older than I remembered, her once perfect blonde hair now streaked with gray, but her eyes were sharp and her smile was knowing. I always knew you'd be the one to shake things up, she said as we sat down. I raised an eyebrow. You did. She nodded, stirring her tea with deliberate slowness. Sharon likes to think she's untouchable, but everyone has their limits. And you, my dear, have been pushed far past yours. I leaned forward, lowering my voice. I need to know everything. Anything I can use to take her down, to make her feel even a fraction of what she's put me through. Linda's smile widened, and she reached into her bag, pulling out a manila folder. I think you'll find this enlightening. Inside were photos, documents, even a few handwritten notes, bank transfers, letters, evidence of Sharon's less than savory dealings, her manipulations, her lies. What is this? I asked, flipping through the pages. Leverage, Linda said simply. I've been sitting on this for years waiting for the right moment. Sharon burned a lot of bridges on her way to the top, and I've kept the receipts. I looked up at her, my mind racing. Why are you helping me? Because, she said, her expression darkening. Sharon deserves this. And because I know you'll use it better than I ever could. I arrived back at the house just as the sun was setting, the folder tucked securely under my arm. Inside, the air was thick with tension. Sharon was pacing the living room, her face flushed with anger, while David sat on the couch, staring blankly at the floor. The moment I stepped inside, Sharon turned on me, her voice sharp and cutting. You have no right to do this. To humiliate us like this. Humiliate you? I interrupted, my tone icy. Sharon, I've barely gotten started. I dropped the folder onto the coffee table with a loud thud. Take a look, I said, crossing my arms. David reached for it first, his hands shaking as he opened it. His eyes widened as he flipped through the pages, his face growing paler with each passing second. Mom, he said, his voice barely a whisper. What is this? Sharon snatched the folder from him, her eyes scanning the contents. For a moment she was silent, her expression unreadable. Then she slammed it shut and glared at me. You think this will destroy me? She spat. You think a few old skeletons will bring me down? I stepped closer, my voice low and steady. I don't think, Sharon. I know. This isn't just about you. This is about David, about me, about the way you've poisoned this family for years. And now, I smiled a cold, hard smile. Now everyone will know exactly who you are. Her eyes narrowed, but there was a flicker of fear in them now, a crack in the armor. David stood up, his voice trembling. Mom, is this true? Don't be ridiculous, she snapped, but her voice lacked its usual conviction. This is nothing. She's trying to manipulate you. I'm not the manipulator here, I said, cutting her off. That's your specialty, isn't it, Sharon? Manipulation. Control. Lies. Well, guess what? Your time's up. Sharon's face twisted with rage, but before she could respond, David grabbed the folder and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. I turned to Sharon, meeting her glare with unwavering calm. You wanted a war, Sharon, I said quietly. Now you've got one. And for the first time since I'd met her, Sharon didn't have a word to say. The house was eerily quiet after David stormed out. Sharon and I stood facing each other in the living room, the tension so thick it felt like the walls were closing in. You think you've won something here? Sharon hissed, her voice low but sharp as a knife. You have no idea who you're dealing with. I tilted my head, letting her words hang in the air for a moment before responding. And that's where you've always been wrong, Sharon. I know exactly who I'm dealing with. A woman who's terrified of losing control. A woman so insecure. She tears down everyone around her just to feel powerful. Her eyes narrowed, but there was a flicker of something else in her expression, doubt. You're all bark, I continued, stepping closer. But when someone finally bites back, you crumble. Before she could respond, the front door slammed open, and David stormed back in, the folder clutched tightly in his hand. His face was flushed, his eyes wild, and for a brief, fleeting moment, I thought he might finally confront her. But instead he turned to me. Ellie, he said, his voice shaking. What the hell is this? Why would you do this to us? I blinked, momentarily stunned by the sheer audacity of his words. Us. I repeated, my voice rising. David, your mother has been tearing me apart for years, and you've stood by and let it happen. Now you want to act like you're the victim. He shook his head, his grip tightening on the folder. This isn't just about her. This is our family. You're destroying everything. I laughed bitterly, the sound echoing in the quiet room. Destroying everything? David, there's nothing left to destroy. Your mother made sure of that a long time ago. Sharon, who had been silently fuming, finally spoke up. Don't you dare blame me for your failures, she snapped. You've never been good enough for David, and now you're proving it by dragging this family through the mud. I turned to her, my patience wearing dangerously thin. You want to talk about dragging this family through the mud? Let's talk about the loans, Sharon. The backroom deals. The lies you've told to keep up appearances. Do you think David's the only one I've been digging into? Her face went pale, and for the first time she seemed genuinely speechless. That's right, I said, my voice cold. I know everything. About the money you funneled out of your late husband's business. About the way you manipulated David into taking the fall for your mistakes. All of it. David's head snapped toward her. What is she talking about? Sharon opened her mouth to respond, but no sound came out. Go on, Sharon, I said, crossing my arms. Tell him. Tell your son how you've been using him as your personal scapegoat for years. David looked between us, his face a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. "Mom?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's not what it looks like," she said finally, her voice trembling. "David, you know I've always done what's best for this family." "Stop," he interrupted, holding up a hand. "Just stop." For a moment the room was silent, the weight of everything hanging heavily in the air. Then David turned to me, his expression hardening. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" he said bitterly. "Enjoying this?" I repeated, incredulous. "David, do you honestly think I wanted it to come to this? That I spent years putting up with your mother's abuse just so I could have this moment? No, David. I'm not enjoying this. But I'm done being your punching bag." His jaw tightened and he looked away, unable to meet my gaze. "I've made my decision," I continued, my voice steady now. "I'm leaving, and I'm taking everything I'm entitled to. You can figure out the rest on your own." I turned and headed for the stairs, but Sharon's voice stopped me in my tracks. "You'll regret this," she said, her tone venomous. "Mark my words, Ellie. You'll regret it." I glanced back over my shoulder, a small smile playing on my lips. "The only thing I regret," I said quietly, "is not doing this sooner." And with that I walked upstairs, leaving them to pick up the pieces of the mess they had created. The finality of it all hit me as I stood in the now empty living room, my suitcase by my side. The house felt hollow, not just from the lack of furniture or decorations, but from the absence of what should have been. A home filled with love, respect, and partnership. I hadn't heard from David or Sharon since the confrontation days ago. David had stormed off that night, and Sharon hadn't dared speak another word to me, too stunned by the truth I'd laid bare. I imagined they were still reeling, scrambling to figure out how to untangle the web they had spun for years, a web that had finally ensnared them both. But that wasn't my concern anymore. The lessons I'd learned over the past 10 years were hard-earned, and they had come with a price. I'd lost pieces of myself along the way, pieces I was only now beginning to reclaim. I stood there for a moment, taking in the quiet, the stillness, and then I pulled out the envelope I'd prepared. Inside were 2 letters, one for David and one for Sharon. I left them on the coffee table where I knew they'd find them. David's letter was simple. "David, you had a choice. For 10 years you chose silence, complicity, and comfort over standing up for the person who stood by you. I don't hate you, but I don't pity you either. You made your bed, and now you'll lie in it without me. I hope one day you find the courage to be the man I thought you were. Ellie." Asterisk. Sharon's was equally concise but sharper. "Sharon, control is an illusion and yours is slipping. You spent your life trying to dominate others, but the only thing you truly accomplished was isolating yourself. Now the people you used as pawns are gone, and you have nothing left but the lies you told yourself to feel powerful. I hope you find peace someday, but I doubt you will. Ellie." With that, I grabbed my suitcase and walked out the door for the last time. I didn't look back as I drove away, but the further I got from the house, the lighter I felt. For years I had been living for someone else. Someone who would never appreciate me, who would never see my worth. And now I was finally living for myself. I found a small apartment in the city, nothing fancy, but it was mine. The first morning there, I stood by the window with a cup of coffee, watching the sun rise over the skyline. It wasn't just a new day, it was a new life. The lesson I realized wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about recognizing my own value and refusing to let anyone diminish it. To the women who feel unseen, unappreciated, or trapped in lives they've outgrown, know this: you are stronger than you think. You don't have to settle for less than you deserve, no matter how long you've been told otherwise. Walking away isn't failure. Sometimes it's the bravest thing you can do. As I stood there watching the world wake up, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Freedom. And this time I wouldn't let anyone take it from me.